Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is our podcast, Understanding the Source of Wickedness. And my name is Andrew Hernandez, and these are my collaborators.
Raymond Orozco.
David Olivares.
And Jonathan Rivera.
So today we're going to be going over a very, very infamous character, a serial killer who was born and raised in El Paso. So many lives. There are too many lives. Lives including Jenny Vincow, Dale Okazaki, Maria Hernandez, Veronica Hugh, Vincent and Mancine Zazara, Bill Doy, Carol Kyle, Mabel Bell, Florentine Lang, Mary Louise Cannon, Whitney Bennett, Joyce Lucille Nelson, Sophie Dickman, Max, and Layla Nadine. China Rong Covenant, Elias Abawath, and more victims. All names that belong to human beings who deserved a beginning, middle, and a peaceful end. All of them, unfortunately, never reaching the finish line the way that every normal life should. All of these names may be unfamiliar to the world at large, but they should be. These are the lives that were lost to the rage of one man who is far more famous than he should be. A serial killer with the goal of spreading the most demented sins of man upon this beautiful world and its people. A monster with a notorious nickname, one he did not deserve to earn. His name is Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez is not only one of the most prolific serial killers in the U.S., very commonly renowned as the Night Stalker, but he's also remembered for starting a career of wickedness at a sad young age of 9, where he began to show signs of hatred and lack of feeling for humanity. By the age of 25, Richard had accumulated a large list of crimes that he would be charged for. The laundry list of terror includes 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 6 rapes, 3 lewd acts on children, 2 kidnappings, 5 robberies, 14 burglaries, and several counts of deviant sex. All in all, we might ask the question if Ramirez was a classic case of being born an evil person, but there is another factor that we need to consider to fully understand Ramirez. Traditional psychoanalysts claim that by the age of 5 or 6, we see that character development is fully realized. While this way of thinking in terms of the psychological mind is outdated, it helps us to pinpoint and cue in on something more important. Before we go over the profile and analysis of how Ramirez's mind was shaped, we will look at Richard's youth. Richard Ramirez was the 5th born child to Mexican immigrant parents Mercedes and Julian Ramirez, named Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, February 29th in 1960, in El Paso, Texas. Very little can be fully clarified about young Ramirez's lifestyle and childhood, but what is known is the fact that he sustained a great many head injuries and traumas that would serve as the blueprints for a mind so deranged and altered that it would be impossible to think it was normal. A sad question to think about is how different the lives of the victims' families would have been if the upbringing was more loving and nurturing instead of ignorant to his growing persona. It is very important to note that while Richard was better known for his serial killing, satanic worshipping black heart, we need to remember that unfortunate circumstances and the way that mental health reared its ugly head into this scenario helps us to understand how this young boy turned into the devil himself. The youth's mind is the most important factor here. Everyone is built of different components, and the inner workings of the mind can never fully be defined since everyone is different. Everyone has different experiences, perspectives, proclivities, and tastes in life. In the field of psychology, we get an important fact that helps us to build a real profile of our interest in today's podcast. People are each born with genetically determined temperaments and inherited dispositions, born into any given environment that has a real chokehold over the development of any given child growing up. By the age when a child can start heading towards school, the potential development begins to form and thus narrows down the list of propensities that distinguishes them from any other child. In simpler terms, the way that a young mind acts is because of not only the environment that shapes them, but because they experience and take things into their mind that they see as being okay. In our case for Richard, his family must have been the deciding factor. It is reported that his father would beat him, and while people cannot fathom how that decides Ramirez's development, it is essential that we take away it severely affected him for the remainder of his life. The evil in our hearts is there, but the only real way it can be awakened is if it is spurred on by outside forces and our own moral choices. Richard decided to embrace the wicked evil that had been building in his heart. He yearned for this desire to inflict evil on others in any way his demented and tortured mind could conjure up. Lack of love, lack of a morally safe upbringing, and lack of certain nurturing components easily point a child's mind to the direction of evil growing up. Harboring a very unhealthy relationship with sadism and Satanism only helped to reinforce this difference between good and evil. We found out that Richard suffered several brain and head injuries, pinpointing definitive evidence of his downward spiral, and another factor of this man spiraling ever so down the rabbit hole was in the form of his older cousin who was just returning from the Vietnam War. Miguel would influence this violent and rape-seeking side of Richard, bragging a lot about his time in the war, raping and violently executing Vietnamese women, taking pictures, even going so far as to exploit Richard's mind with tactics to be able to stealthily carry out these actions. We discovered that at the ages between 2 and 11, he suffered many injuries, including a dresser almost killing him at the age of 2 by falling on his head, a swing ramming into his head at the age of 6, and finally at the age of 11 being diagnosed with epilepsy. He took marijuana and LSD at far too young an age as well, and all of these factors and experiences no doubt shaped young Ramirez's life and turned him into a creature of the night whose spree would inflict terror on so many innocent families for generations.
Here we start the journey that is Richard Ramirez's path in El Paso. The history of the Night Stalker is one that shakes the core of many. The beginning of our path starts at a Sapien Lido Park. Here is where a 2006 flood washes away the homes and memories of many. After this calamity, the city sought to buy 8 acres of the residential land that had been destroyed. The city then relocated the people who lived there and built Sapien Lido Park in its place. Following the childhood of Richard Ramirez leads us to what is now known as Sapien Lido Park. This is stop 1 out of 3 of the places in El Paso that hold relevance to the Night Stalker's life. That is because this is where Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was raised, being the youngest among their 5 siblings. There are many rumors that state the reason Richard Ramirez and his siblings all suffered from birth defects. The 2 leading theories are between either the Ramirez residence was located nearby a nuclear bomb testing site in New Mexico and contamination spread via wind to El Paso, or that because Mercedes Munoz Ramirez, Richard's mother, worked at a boot factory mixing chemicals such as benzene, xylene, and toluene, which are toxic in nature and could have resulted in every child she birthed having birth defects. Some speculate that this was made up for Richard Ramirez's court case and was used to potentially pardon Ramirez, but others believe the latter of the 2 speculations as to why Richard Ramirez and his siblings all had birth defects. This could potentially be a large reason why Ramirez grows up to be the Night Stalker, a deadly serial killer who goes on to kill over a dozen people, as well as traumatize many more. As we continue to track Richard Ramirez through El Paso, the next crucial location that must be addressed is a street where Ramirez's cousin, known to be a Vietnam War veteran, rented out an apartment on Frutas Avenue, reportedly located across the street from the Guardian Angel Catholic Church. At the age of 12, Richard Ramirez would be exposed to the deepest of darks as his cousin shows Ramirez the trophies he collected in his time at Vietnam. These trophies were pictures of women that Ramirez's cousin has allegedly raped, tortured, and killed. This is not where the darkness that is shown to Ramirez stops. The following year, Ramirez witnesses his cousin shoot his own wife in the face over an altercation. Seeing this event occur changes the minds of those who are young, as well as the minds of those who are fully mature. If Richard Ramirez is looking up to his cousin at this point in his life, then this could be a large hint as to why Ramirez turned into the Night Stalker who disregards humanity. Looking into Richard Ramirez's childhood so far, we can see that he was born with birth defects and was almost certainly traumatized by the actions and stories his cousin exposed to him, all before the age of 14. This is the final stop of Richard Ramirez's story that occurs within the borders of the West Texas town of El Paso. Here, Richard Ramirez attends Jefferson High School for 3 years as a freshman, from 1979 to 1982. This is the chapter we follow that holds most of its information through hearsay and remnants of the past retold by those who were related to people who knew Richard Ramirez as peers in high school. Richard Ramirez was, as his peers thought of him, weird, reclusive, odd, and something to be avoided by all social groups besides one or two outlier friends. His close friends were far and few in between, and reportedly, his friends had nothing but good words to say about Ramirez, while the overwhelming majority of classmates avoided him like the plague. This is a crucial landmark as we follow Richard Ramirez's story in becoming the Night Stalker, because this showed how his peers viewed him in his last moments in El Paso before he went to move in California. And now, I will pass on this to my colleague.
Richard Ramirez's spree of wickedness had led to his undoing, as in the summer of 1985, the authorities of California released dozens of magazines with Ramirez's face and name. This would cause a chaotic chain reaction in the times that followed. The subsequent arrest and conviction of the Night Stalker would prove to be a strenuous time for law enforcement, attorneys, jurors, and all who were involved. While the courtroom saw plenty of drama and complications within the vicinity, the state of California, let alone the entire nation, began to obsess over the elusive creature known as Richard Ramirez. 30th of 1985, Ramirez had planned on leaving Boyle Heights, California, to visit his brother in Tucson, Arizona, when he discovered the papers identifying him to be the serial killer who had been tormenting the Los Angeles area, infamously referring to him as the Night Stalker and El Matador by smaller publications. To his concern, if he felt any, Ramirez attempted to leave the area and evade capture from the authorities by stealing a nearby car from an older woman, later identified to be Angelina de la Torre. Her husband, Manuel, had thankfully been with his wife when Ramirez attempted to carjack her. Manuel had gotten into a physical altercation with Ramirez and managed to strike him in the head with a loose fence post nearby. Ramirez found himself incapacitated and surrounded by 10 nearby residents who proceeded to assault him and call him El Matador, a name given to him by the local Hispanic magazine publication, LA Opinion. And that was the name he heard being shouted at him when he found himself being harassed by the people who had harbored fear and resentment towards him. It was around 8 a.m. on August 30th when the authorities arrived and arrested the broken killer in the suburban area of Boyle Heights. Ramirez was plucked from the mob and brought into custody that very morning. Following the arrest of Richard Ramirez, the state of California quickly held a jury selection for his trial. An extensive selection, turns out. The District of Orange County started its preparations for the trials and required a possible 2-year commitment from its 12 jurors and alternates, which was notably a large order considering the size of the county. By the summer of 1987, the state of California had barely appointed Alan Yockelson and Judge Halpin for the prosecution team. A few public defenders were assigned to Ramirez's defense, but he had expressed disgust and/or contempt for both of his attorneys upon meeting. Eventually, Daniel and Arturo Hernandez, sharing no relation, were assigned to Ramirez, and despite no experience regarding the death penalty, as well as that is what was being considered punishment for the Night Stalker, both practitioners had worked together previously on homicide defense cases. The process had proven to be a chaotic one. Hernandez, who was known to be an insufficient attorney, requested many delays due to poor health conditions caused by stress, and often tried to seek an appeal. Daniel had even reportedly gotten into a physical altercation with the prosecutor. All his appeals were rejected. and Hernandez was considered deficient, according to media reports. The trials for Ramirez finally took place in January of 1989, nearly 4 years after his arrest. The prosecution team, led by D.A. Halpin, had their opening statement, pointing out the 13 murders and over a dozen felony cases known to be committed by Ramirez due to physical evidence left on the crime scenes. Among this evidence, released to the public during trial, included fingerprints, ballistics, and shoe impressions. One of them had even been on the face of one of the victims. Witness accounts proved to be a challenge as well for the courtroom, as many witnesses had clear descriptions, but others were more in dispute. Criminal psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, an expert in eyewitness testimony from the University of Washington, testified that the stress of assaults may have affected the witness's ability to accurately recall details. During his 4 years in prison awaiting trial, Ramirez had reportedly boasted about the crimes he committed to the inmates, declaring himself to be a supercriminal. There was also discussion of Ramirez committing murder and other heinous crimes during his 4 years in prison. A self-professed Satanist, Ramirez would shout about his allegiance and claim that he loved Satan. Despite his lurid behavior, Daniel Hernandez attempted to use deception to earn better favor when it came time for Ramirez to testify. This included calling for Richard's father, Julian Ramirez, to attest that his son was in El Paso, Texas on Memorial Day weekend of 1984, when 3 of Richard's victims were brutally robbed and murdered. Additionally, Julian served as a character witness for his son and pled that he be found not guilty. This would prove to be in vain, however, as Richard's financial records had revealed that he was in fact in Los Angeles, not El Paso, and had visited his local dentist that very weekend, dissolving his alibi and putting his legal team in even more hot water. Despite the rigorous trials and countless appeals by his attorney, Richard Ramirez had become something of a public spectacle in America. While many Americans were appalled by him, Ramirez took advantage of the media and press coverage to exhibit a rebellious, bad boy attitude in court. Sporting all black clothing and wearing sunglasses indoors, often an act of defiance against the deputies in the room, Ramirez was notable for having a very colorful character during his trial. Another example of his delinquent nature was when he had infamously shouted "Hail Satan" in the courtroom on one of his first trials, with a pentagram on full display written on his hand. What's more, the power had gone out on another occasion, resulting in police shouting for everyone to get on the floor and proceeded to escort a manic Ramirez out of the room. This would later create more hysteria and less favor for Ramirez and his legal team, as at the time, the United States saw the rise of the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic, a moral panic, which continued to plague the world today, was notable for causing Americans to fear for the young adults at the time and for their safety, as it was believed they were more susceptible to abuse and manipulation from alleged cultists, Satanists, and other religious fanatics who would cause harm on whoever they could. Richard Ramirez was considered by psychologists to be an essential poster boy for the Satanic Panic, given his flagrant interest in the occult, his personal style, and advocating for violence and self-destructive behavior, all of which led to people to have anxiety and paranoia about who their children, particularly teenagers, were watching on television or hearing about on the papers. The Night Stalker and his court antics were notable for also gaining the attention of young women who considered him to be cute or attractive. The trials went on for roughly 8 months, rather swift given that the jury was expected to serve for over 2 years. Despite the controversies, and even one of the jurors dying under suspicious circumstances, which was proven to be a cause of suicide, not conspiracy against the courtroom, and even theories of breaking the Night Stalker out of confinement, many brave witnesses and survivors provided accurate accounts that proved Ramirez was indeed responsible for the crimes. He couldn't care less, however, when it came to his indictment. As he stated, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." Richard Ramirez was ultimately found guilty of all 43 charges, including 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, burglary, and multiple accounts of sexual assault and rape. Too many to count. Ramirez was given the death penalty by the state of California, as it was allowed at the time, and would spend the remainder of his life awaiting execution. Ramirez remained in prison with no parole chances until his death in 2013. His death was a relief to many, but others often agreed that he should have suffered more for all the grief, pain, and fear he caused as the Night Stalker.
Okay, so by this point in Richard Ramirez's life, in 1982, he relocated to California and moved to the city of Los Angeles from Texas, where the majority of his crimes and heinous actions would occur and terrorize the occupants. He would go on to form a bad cocaine addiction and commit burglaries while also practicing Satanism. On April 10th of that year, Ramirez would kill his first victim in San Francisco, a 9-year-old Chinese-American girl by the name of Mei Luong, in the basement of a hotel where Ramirez was living. She was sexually assaulted before being stabbed to death. Afterwards, Ramirez would hang her body from a pipe. Sometime later, on June 28th of 1984, was his first discovered murder of a 79-year-old woman, Jenny Van Cao. After being sexually assaulted and stabbed to death while Ramirez attempted to burglarize her home. Around 9 months later, on March 17th, 1985, his next victim would be Maria Hernandez, who was outside of her home in Rosemont, California. He shot her in the face, but miraculously she survived when the bullet instead hit a set of keys, which led to her to survive. However, unfortunately, her roommate, Dale Yoshi Okazaki, was the one Ramirez managed to murder. Soon that same night, however, Ramirez was not satisfied with those assaults, so then he shot and killed a 30-year-old Tsai Lian Yu after pulling her out of her car, which sent the media into a frenzy, dubbing him the Valley Intruder and the Walking Killer by the press. In the same month of that year, he committed 3 separate acts by attacking the Doi family on May 14th. He broke into Bill and Lillian Doi's home in Monterey Park and shot Bill in the face and bounded Lillian as he searched their home for valuables, and afterwards sexually assaulted Lillian. Soon after, Bill later had died in the hospital. On May 29th, Ramirez stole a car, drove it to Monrovia, California, and broke into Mabel Bell and Florence Lang's home. He attacked Lang with a hammer, bound her to the bed, and bonded and attacked Bell. He used Bell's lipstick to draw a pentagram on her body and the walls of their bedrooms after raping her. And when the two were found days later, Bell eventually died from her injuries. The next day, on May 30th, he drove the stolen car to Burbank, California, and broke into Carol Kyle's home. He then bounded her and her 11-year-old son. He then had her son point out where the valuables were to steal them, and afterwards raped Carol, and tied her son to her, and later fled the scene. On July 2nd, Ramirez drove the same stolen car to Arcadia, California, to Mary Cannon's home, and knocked her out with a lamp and stabbed her with one of her knives from her kitchen, and she was later found dead. A couple days later, on July 5th, Ramirez headed to Sierra Madre, California, and attacked 16-year-old Whitney Bennett in her sleep. He hit her with a tire iron and tried to strangle her with a telephone cord. Luckily, the cord broke, and she began to breathe again, and Ramirez abruptly left, believing that Jesus saved her. 2 days later, on July 7th, he incorporated his satanic practices on one of his victims by entering Sophie Dickman's home, bounded and assaulted her at gunpoint, stole her jewelry, and told her to swear to Satan that he stole everything of value in her home. Then later on that month, on July 20th, Ramirez purchased a machete and drove a different stolen car to Glendale, California, where he entered the home of Layla and Maxine Nading and killed them both with that same machete and gun, then afterwards burglarized their home. The same day, he drove to Sun Valley, and broke into the Covenant household, and fatally shot Chain Rock Covenant, and beat and shot and raped Sumkid Covenant, and bounded their 8-year-old son and forced Sumkid to tell him where the valuables were, and fled the scene after telling her to swear to Satan that there was nothing else. The following month, he continued his killing spree, and on August 6th, he broke into the home of Chris and Virginia Peterson, where he would shoot Chris in the neck and Virginia in the face. Chris did attempt to fight back Ramirez, but Ramirez managed to escape. However, the couple did survive, luckily. 2 days later, on August 8th, Ramirez attacked the Abaweth family by breaking into Sakina and Elias Abaweth's home and fatally shooting Elias while he was sleeping. He then handcuffed Sakina, beat and raped her while demanding to know where their jewelry was. He then tied up their 3-year-old son and fled the scene. 2 days later, on August 18th, Ramirez ended up leaving Los Angeles and turning his sight towards the San Francisco Bay Area. He broke into Peter and Barbara Pan's home and shot Peter in the head. He then beat and raped Barbara before fatally shooting her and used her lipstick to draw a pentagram and write on their bedroom wall, "Jack the Knife," before fleeing the scene. By August 25th, Ramirez was finally identified as the Night Stalker. He drove to Mission Viejo in another stolen car to the home of the Romero family, where their 13-year-old son James heard Ramirez outside and promptly woke his parents up. Ramirez quickly fled the scene. However, the family managed to capture a glimpse of the car that he was driving and made out the color, license plate, and make and model of the car. That same night, however, he still managed to break into the home of Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson, where he shot Carnes in the head 3 times and told Erickson that he was the Night Stalker, and told her that she must swear to love Satan. He then raped and told them the Night Stalker was here. Erickson managed to survive the encounter, and later told the authorities a detailed description of Ramirez, and then they were able to find the car that he had stolen in Los Angeles. On that stolen car, Ramirez left a fingerprint on the mirror that officials were able to later match to Ramirez. His mugshot was then promptly released, along with the official statement where they said, "We know who you are now, and as soon everyone else will. There will be no place that you can hide." Then finally, on August 31st, he was caught. The day before, Ramirez had taken a bus to Tucson, Arizona to visit his brother. And by that time, he returned to California the next morning. He had noticed the mugshots on all the newspapers. He was then noticed by a group of bystanders and was then soon running from them. He attempted to carjack a woman before a group of bystanders caught up to him. One of them managed to hit Ramirez in the head, and they all pinned him down and began relentlessly beating him until the police got there, where they then handcuffed him and finally arrested him, ending his killing spree. And now I'll pass the last section to my colleague.
Hello, and thank you for watching our podcast, Understanding the Source of Wickedness. My name is Raymond Orozco, along with my colleagues, David Oliveras, Andrew Hernandez, and Jonathan Rivera.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Stay safe out there.
Be careful.